Welcome to our Frogpond Journey, Editing for Life and Other Haiku Explorations, a presentation by Francine Banwarth and Michele Root-Bernstein on the occasion of our stepping down as editors of Frogpond. When Francine and I took up the editorship of Frogpond in February 2012, we didn't know what to expect. We only knew that we were excited, and a bit scared too, by the challenge of reading and selecting and arranging haiku, haibun, linked forms, essays, and book reviews. We realized we would learn a lot about the haiku arts and the haiku community. We were prepared to open our arms and hearts wide and to grow in the process. And the first good thing that happened for us was Christopher Patchell's offer to design our covers. After much discussion back and forth, we came up with a vision for the cover, one that has ably seen us through our 4-year tenure as editors. A big thank you to Chris. Here's what that vision looked like inside the cover: to provide a forum for the best work and best promise in contemporary haiku, to select haiku with life, to enable poetic transition from personal meaning to public contribution, to serve seasoned, novice, and pioneering poets alike. Let me explain in a bit more detail what we meant by this. We wanted to provide a forum for English language haiku that was inclusive and excellent, encouraging and challenging. What did we mean by a forum that's inclusive? One that serves English language haiku worldwide, voices old and new, novice, seasoned, and masterful poets, traditional, contemporary, and pioneering or avant-garde haiku. In the 4 years of our tenure, we received and published from roughly 42 states in the U.S., 7 provinces in Canada, and 39 other countries around the world. We received nearly 500 submissions during each reading period. That's 5,000 ku. A good number of these were 575, some of which we considered. Most submissions were traditional and contemporary in form, and a handful were pioneering haiku. An aside on how we handled submissions: Francine handled the first screen, returning submissions that did not meet very minimum artistic standards. She forwarded all subs for consideration to a dedicated email account. I compiled each submission into an enormous Word file, marking those haiku, haibun, linked forms, etc. that I liked. Once all submissions were compiled and marked, I sent the file to Francine, who marked her preferences. There followed several rounds as we noted our joint picks, argued the case for personal picks, and otherwise worked towards a consensus. This back and forth often took up to 2 weeks. When all was said and done, we were looking for excellence, for what I first conceived of as life in a haiku seti sort of way. And like any good scientist or crackpot, we had to recognize life when we saw it. Haiku life stands for L, language, I, imagery, F, form, E, elusiveness of experience. L meant lucky language, a la William Stafford, language that surprises us, that leaps and also connects, that makes use of the sounds of words and multiple meanings to create the poetic spell that Lee Gerge and Scott Metz refer to in Haiku 2015. I meant imagery that is refreshing and new or newly visioned. F meant form that disappears into itself, whether current best practice or experimental, form that explores what else is possible, two-liners or calligram-like structures, for instance. We looked for form that is supple, not rigid, that fit with the language and imagery of the ku. And E meant elusiveness, that works effectively to open up experience, to engage, and to enlighten. Engaging the excellence or life of a poem, we found ourselves constantly aware of what Francine dubbed the Goldilocks Effect. It became a kind of template for understanding how a poem functioned well or not so well. Here are some verbatim notes taken at Francine's kitchen table as we considered one poem or another. Too much. Too leading, too telling, too many words, too explicit, too close, too done already, too sentimental, too much rigidity of form, too contrived, too much mystery. Not enough. Not enough juxtaposition, not enough image, not enough surprise, not enough freshness, not enough poetry, not enough form, not enough ambiguity, not enough self-editing, self-critiquing. And just right in choice of words, in presence, in imagery, in order of experience, in the use of 3 lines or 1 or 2, just right amount of room for the reader to enter in without getting lost. Note, although what would Goldilocks say was an important consideration for us during our editing process, too much, not enough, just right was not a checklist but an orientation. It helped us understand why one haiku didn't make the cut as much as why another one did. We wanted Frogpond to be a forum that was encouraging as well, and we understood what that meant in the following way. Different poems might work in different ways. There is, in fact, variety in creative accomplishment. Creativity is often defined as effective novelty, and whether or not something is new or valuable depends on its socio-cultural context, personal, public, or historical. Of these 3 contexts, people who study cultural innovation or even the development of English language haiku will be most often concerned with public and historical creativity. All very well and good, but these contexts must be supported by a groundswell of personal creativity. In other words, what is novel and effective to an individual or small circles of family and friends, even if not yet interesting to a larger public. Without personal creativity, there is no public creativity. Nurture one, nurture the other. When we came across poems that we felt were verging on the intersection of personal and public contexts, we tried to encourage the poet to consider how the haiku might be revised in order to be appreciated in the public sphere, in order to make that transition to the public sphere. We'll get to some of that editing in a bit. Negotiating the creative process on a personal level is a challenge in and of itself, and it can look something like the creative spiral here, which involves a recursive back and forth between the idea of experience we want to express, the action we take to write a first draft, the feedback we get from ourselves, others, or editors, the revisions we undertake in light of that feedback, and the evolution of the idea, its expression, and our personal facility with the art and craft of haiku. Since it is not unidirectional, you can enter the spiral at any point. Taking action may mean a return to idea, which jumps to feedback and back to action, and so forth. There is also a communal creative process engaging poet, editor, and reader in the same spiraling give and take in creating the poem. The poet creates a coup that is only half finished, awaiting the reader to complete it. The editor is a first reader and first responder who can help the poet see how the piece reads in and of itself. Enter the communal engagement as reader or editor or poet, and you learn and contribute different stuff. Spending time at different points of engagement, you sharpen your craft as a whole. If you take the time to learn how to read haiku of other poets, to edit haiku, you will write better haiku. This, at any rate, was our hope going into the Frogpond editorship, to expand as readers, as editors, and finally, as poets. This is how we saw our role as editors in the communal creative process, negotiating the expressions of hundreds of poets. We needed to balance the interests and needs of novice and master, of poets working in traditional, contemporary, and experimental forms. We had a responsibility to our poets, who competed first against themselves Second, against other submissions, a responsibility to welcome them into the process. We had a responsibility to each other as well as editors and readers to argue with each other for the value of poems we believed in. We insisted on openness to all voices and to second, third, and fourth readings. We thought it a strength of our editorship that there were two of us. First, because the selection process necessarily took a longer time as we went back and forth and allowed things to sit. Second, because we pushed each other to reconsider this or that poem, to expand beyond our knee-jerk reactions to coup. The partnership forced us to question and articulate what we were trying to do. The end result was not just subjective, but in some part objective, or at any rate, there was a shared element to our final selections. Finally, we felt the obligation of choice to choose the best on offer as seen through our eyes of a balanced mix of poets. And at the end of the day, our final selection was about the work. Let's take a look now at some of our editing processes and assessments. We each picked poems from Frogpond that we think exemplify different elements of life. First, L, language that delights. I picked Autumn Sky by Melissa Allen for its surprising use of the word deciduous, possibly the first and last use in a haiku. Autumn sky, only one of us, deciduous. That word tells us much about what to see and feel in the poem, how to interpret the poet's relationship to nature and the season. Two, there's such a nice use of sound values in this coup, autumn, only one, and the slant rhyme of us, deciduous. The words simply belong together. Francine picked Two Ballerinas by Peter Yovu for its unexpected mix of words. Two ballerinas in one skin, a newborn foal. The language draws us right in, right away, and keeps us there with the repetition of hard N's and soft L's. And because we couldn't keep to just two haiku, consider as well this poem by Roberta Beery, Deep Uncharted Waters Just Past the Boatman's Smile. There's surprise in the double use of just past. Are we just past the deep waters or just past the smile? Both, of course. William Stafford's lucky language, indeed. Now for imagery that is fresh. You'll notice that Francine picked Two Ballerinas again, and how appropriate, for the very best poems brim with life in all its aspects. In Two Ballerinas, the concrete imagery feels absolutely unique in its combination. The two ballerinas are also those four limbs encased in the birthing sac. The surprise we experience in the language is more than sustained by the freshness of imagery. I chose Creek Song by Kala Ramesh. Creek Song, autumn wind swinging on the barnyard gate. Line 1 offers us a delightful portmanteau word. Lines 2 and 3, an interesting twist on a common image. The poem makes us rethink the wind and the gate. Francine threw in as our third Blister Moon by Eve Lockering. Blister Moon, a wish rubbed raw. This haiku features a unique joining of moon and blister and wish that draws us right into the bodily feelings that reveal the emotional state of the poet-narrator. I picked The Sudden Way by David Boyer as a good example of form that functions. The sudden way, spring peepers, it all works out. In this case, the haiku bends standard form to accentuate the imagery. The delivery of the lines mimics the content. Line 2, spring peepers, inserts itself, announces itself into the flow of thought that links lines 1 and 3, exactly as the spring peepers do when winter reluctantly gives over to a new season. As far as Francine is concerned, you can't keep a good haiku down. In Two Ballerinas, the one-line format adds to, rather than detracts from, the overall delivery and experience. The reader absorbs the miracle of birth all at once, rather than in 2 or 3 increments. but then is compelled to go back and read again, to experience again this moment so skillfully rendered. For a third example, I threw in Thrift Store Drop by Leroy Gorman. Thrift Store Drop, the small song a bird brings. There's nothing fancy here in the form, yet perfect craft in the layout of words, the poet leaving the surprise, the word brings rather than sings, for the last line for maximum effect. And note how necessary that word brings is, because it takes us right back to line 1. In this way, form confirms the poem's implied or embedded metaphoric thinking, that there is as much charity and succor in the beauties of nature as in our own goods. Francine picked 2 ballerinas yet again for its elusiveness of experience. This haiku teases the imagination rather than dulls it. The reader sees the newborn foal in a new way. Limbs are no longer limbs, but a pair of ballerinas in the dance of birth. I chose Coy Mouths by Brent Goodman. Coy mouths, breaching the surface, the sky inside us. It's this last line that opens the poem up to multiple interpretations and ineffable feeling. What does it mean for the sky to be internalized? There's also the elusiveness of that second line that can pivot either way. How does the sky breach the surface? Something feels so right about the mentation without dictating conclusions. There's also the immediate attraction of assonance and slant rhyme, again an instance where more than one element of life is utilized to maximum effectiveness. Finally, Francine noted that 3,000 Years Old by Charles Baker pulls the reader up short in a way that is wholly unexpected. 3,000 years old, a drawing of the girl next door. What is time, anyway, that eons of ages past can fold and compress to an instant felt in the present? As editors, we don't ask of anyone what we don't ask of ourselves as poets. Editing others has enabled us to better edit ourselves, as you'll see in just a moment. We think the exercise is so valuable, we want to share with you some examples of our Frogpond editing in action first. On the lookout for poems that light up with their own kind of life, we sometimes come across poems that are almost just right. Poems with the potential to light up with a bit of rethinking or a minor tweak. When we felt potential in a poem, there were questions we might ask the poet. What were you thinking when you wrote the poem? Did you have other lines originally? What were you feeling? What was the occasion? Consider this original submission. Pond Voices, a penny carries my wish, moon deep. In the case of this haiku by Sandy Prey, we loved lines 2 and 3, but felt line 1 was too weak, too vague. It needed a bit of rethinking. We asked, what are the voices? Is there some other way to image that first line? Sandy's first alternative was this, between frogs, which struck us as still a bit flat, and other frog alternatives seemed too fanciful, not literal and not truly figurative either. Francine got back to Sandy with our response. Sandy's next email to Francine was an eye-opener. The truth, Sandy wrote, was this, quote, I was waiting for a loved one undergoing a second PET scan for cancer late one afternoon. Worried about the outcome, I found a pond with a small fountain outside the hospital. Listening to water sounds, I took the penny and threw it in with my wish, rippling the day moon's reflection. In other words, the first line is really PET scan. Francine's reaction was spontaneous. Wow, this is it. Somehow, it just felt there was so much more to the story. What was a so-so juxtaposition is now remarkable and excellent. The revised haiku, PET scan, a penny carries my wish, moon deep, is published in Frogpond 38.3. Sometimes we felt that an almost just right poem only needed a minor tweak. Consider the original submission of Monsoon Rain by Srinjay Chakravarti. Monsoon rain, film posters turn into pentimenti. We felt drawn to this haiku for some interesting word choice and unusual imagery. The word pentimenti refers to alterations to a painting, as evidenced by traces of previous work, revealing an artist's change of mind. The word is Italian for repentance. Lots of meaning for the reader to chew on here. But we also felt that the language, specifically the verb to turn into, did not adequately evoke the experience. There was not enough or not the right precision of action. We considered some alternatives such as fade into or turn to, but weren't convinced these were strong enough to suggest to the poet. We were after the erosion of the poster paper effected by the constant rain, but came up blank. Then, thinking of the posters drying, we came up with peel and liked it for its definitiveness and alliteration with pentimenti. We suggested the change in verb as an example of what we were after, and in this instance the poet agreed. Monsoon Rain, film posters, peel to pentimenti, was published in Frogpond 38-2. Let me give you a sense of the same editing discussions Francine and I had around a few haiku that some HNA participants kindly allowed us to consider and think about in advance. We see this not as a critique of a poem, but as an invitation to edit the poem as if it were a challenge we might all work on, which as far as the communal creative process is concerned, it is. Moreover, it is good to remember we were all novices once, and when we consider where we begin and how we learn the craft, we become more aware of where we are now in terms of craft skill and artistic understanding. So take a look at Early Snowfall, a white blanket rumpled by pumpkins. In terms of the Goldilocks effect, this coup has too much and not enough, but with a bit of prodding and probing, it might begin to sing. There is some strong imagery here. We can see the snow and the pumpkins, and winter coming perhaps too soon. But the coup has too much detail about essentially only one thing: the snowfall, the white blanket of snow, the pumpkins under the snow. The white blanket is such a common expression for new fallen snow that we go right to the explicit metaphor and get stuck there. Haiku typically get away with an unspoken or implicit metaphor when the image is first and foremost a literal one. But it's hard to see what a real white blanket is doing in the pumpkin patch. Warming the pumpkins? If so, the reader needs a bit more direction. If this haiku suffers from too much about one image, there is consequently not enough imagery altogether. It may be there's just one part of the poem here, and what is needed is a second image. Some questions we might ask the poet include, what is it besides the language effect that draws you to the rumpling pumpkins? Something that looks similar, that functions in the same way, that feels emotionally similar? The next poem we consider is this: Wet crow perching high on the lamppost as it rains, patiently waiting. Some Goldilocks observations we might make. This is a coup with too much description. It is redundant and telling. The 5-7-5 format has allowed the poet to fill in the experience with additional detail at the expense of internal comparisons or resonance. We might also note that the central image is too done already. There are lots of crows sitting on a variety of objects in the annals of haiku, which places a burden on any poem that takes on the image to offer something new and different, to play, in essence, with all the crow coup that go before it. Ultimately, this haiku remains too personal or too vague to join in that particular game. Although as readers we may see a crow perching, we may see a person waiting, but we do not have enough information about either to connect their patience. To deal with these issues, we might ask, Can the poet push to a more original way of expressing the experience? Why, for instance, is the lamppost important to the moment? Does it have something to do with the quality of waiting or the quality of patience? How do we find our way towards originality? Francine and I suggest that the best thing to do is to start reading lots and lots of good haiku online and in journals, to become familiar with popular cliches, but also to recognize the different containers that haiku offer for holding our thoughts. Does the poem want to look like this, for instance? Evening rain, crow and I share the lamppost. Perhaps not. Only the poet knows for sure. But by asking the question and posing a possible solution, we are well on our way to shaking up old habits and exploring new expressions. Finally, let's take a look at this HNA participant poem, Echoes of Sarah's hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, Bring Her Back to Life. This poem has a bit of too much and not enough, but in fact it's right on the edge between personal and public excellence. It's almost just right. It's a very personal haiku, and fine in that form for intimates, but for a greater community something is amiss. It's too telling. It needs to be more suggestive and elusive. Not enough? It needs more space. In other words, a juxtaposition might help. And how about if we don't specify the echo? As poets, we should record our moments personally, but for public communication, come back to them days or weeks or months later and ask, how will readers read this? How can I give them the moment I had, the recognition, the shock of insight that is theirs as well as mine? Perhaps then we would come up with something like this. Nearer, my God, to Thee, the echoes bring her back. Last but not least, we'd like to offer 2 examples of how our editing experience has affected our writing. If nothing else, it has impressed upon us the necessity of editing our own work as well as that of others. In Francine's case, the original phrase, me with my grudges, came to her while she was doing something else, engaged with her very human self, but not writing. Later, while running, she wondered what might be a good juxtaposition of that phrase, and because it was autumn, fallen leaves presented itself. She wrote the coup in 3 lines. Fallen leaves, me with my grudges. This felt okay with a bit of surprise in line 3, but line 1 seemed stale. With her editor's hat on, Francine played around with form and wrote the coup in 2 lines. But nothing much changed in the ways to read the coup, to connect or disconnect the imagery. Then she wrote it in 1 line, and immediately felt that the old and tired image, fallen leaves, had taken on new life, with multiple readings and layers as one word follows the next. In other words, leaves transitions from noun to verb, and fallen no longer applies just to the leaves, but to a sad but true human condition. Fallen leaves me with my grudges appears in Modern Haiku 46:1. In Autumn Trees, Stitches Cast from the Needle, I was trying to relate knitting, an activity with which I often grapple, to weather and to mood. But this particular attempt, by no means the first, did not appeal to the editor in me. As Goldilocks might say, it was too tired and imitative and final. I thought about the elements of life. Could I find some lucky language? Well, knitters speak of casting off in increments. So I tried it with a few other modifications. First chill wind, I cast off stitches in increments. I liked this new 3rd line and the soft I that binds increments to wind, but still worried that the poem was too specific and therefore closed down. I wondered if abstracting the essence of the reality might bring in needed elusiveness. How much detail might be eliminated to good effect? I deleted stitches. Autumn wind, I cast off in increments. In this form, the words cast off immediately opened up to include multiple images and multiple readings, not just about knitting, but about sailing and the discarding of stuff. I also wondered if playing with form a bit might reinforce the imagery, and so placed the second line, I cast off, in a cast-off position. So far, so good. Autumn Wind did very well in a recent kukai. Some parting thoughts as we end this presentation, as Francine and I end our editorship. Writing haiku is an art and a craft. There is much about that craft art that can be learned. We all write bad poems. We all strive to make them good. In fact, according to W.H. Auden, the good poet writes more bad poems than the bad poet. An energizing proposition, if you think about it. For Francine and me, this is the takeaway. It takes time to write well. It takes time to edit well. You have to keep your mind open and receptive. You have to show up at the desk. You can't be rushed. And when you do show up, to revise and rework for a public audience, there are principles you can keep in mind. A haiku needs life to lift off the page. Lucky language, refreshing imagery, functioning form, elusiveness of experience. It needs to invite the reader into the creative and recreative process. A haiku journal needs to capture that process too, in all its variety. As Proust said, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. In our 4-year term at Frogpond, Francine and I have tried to find those eyes and those voices that experience as many haiku landscapes as possible. We can't begin to express our thanks to the Frogpond editors who came before us, who collectively gave us such a good start. We can't thank enough everyone who submitted haiku and related forms, essays and book reviews, who revised their work for us, who read the journal pages, who took the journey with us into parts known and unknown. If haiku is to thrive, it must speak and express what has meaning now and for the future. This involves keeping what works well in haiku. It also depends on change and experimentation in haiku. Emily Dickinson once said, "If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry." Ultimately, Francine and I have had to rely on our own personal heads up, our own response to language, our own openness to experience and to the evolution of haiku expression, our own surprise at how many ways haiku may illuminate the human condition for us and for generations to come. And as we come to the end of our journey, we are filled with gratitude for what we learned along the way. Bon voyage, Frogpond. We wish your next editors an equally rewarding journey.